The James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library has been open to the public since 1927, when Monroe's descendants created it as a repository for their family collections and as a memorial to the nation's fifth president. Located on the site of Monroe's Fredericksburg Law Office, the museum now houses a collection of nearly 22,000 objects, documents, and books pertaining to the life and times of James Monroe. These collections illustrate not only his extensive political career, which included almost every elected office available at the time, but also give us insight into his personal life and that of his family. Monroe was a devoted husband and father who adored his wife and two daughters, but the demands of his career in public service often required great sacrifices for the whole family. We can see both the joys and hardships of their lives in the collections at the James Monroe Museum. Following his service as an officer in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, Monroe was selected to serve in the Virginia Assembly as a representative from King George County in 1782. In 1783, Monroe was appointed to the delegation representing Virginia at the Confederation Congress in Annapolis. In 1784, he was present for the ratification of the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain, which ended the American Revolution and recognized the United States as a nation. Monroe left Congress in 1786 and set up his law practice in Fredericksburg, bringing with him his new wife, Elizabeth Courtwright, who was a native of New York. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe took up residence in a house which they rented from his uncle. Shortly after their arrival in town, their first child, a daughter named Eliza, was born. The family did not stay long in Fredericksburg. In 1789, they moved to Albemarle County near Charlottesville so that Monroe could be closer to his duties in the Virginia legislature. A year later, with the support of his friends Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, he was elected a United States Senator. He was only 32 years old. Many influential political figures at the time recognized that Monroe's star was on the rise. In 1794, President George Washington commissioned Monroe as the ambassador to France, charging him with the task of repairing the relationship between the two countries that had deteriorated since the Revolution. Monroe took the unusual step of bringing his wife and small child with him to France, where the family bought a house in Paris. They would live there for the next 3 years. The Monroes fell in love with the French culture and made many good friends who they would remain close to for the rest of their lives. Among them was the Marquis de Lafayette and his wife, who the Monroes would help to leave the country during the violent upheaval surrounding the French Revolution. A severe disagreement between Washington and Monroe resulted in the president recalling his ambassador from France in 1797. Monroe felt his recall was a personal insult, and he never quite forgave his former commanding officer for publicly humiliating him. However, the Monroe family was happy to return to Virginia and to their farm in Albemarle County. Monroe took up the practice of law once again and traveled the circuit court system. This period of calm was brief, however, and Monroe was elected governor of Virginia 3 times, beginning in 1799. Once again, his family picked up and moved their household to the governor's mansion in Richmond, and they purchased a new farm near Charlottesville, which adjoined Jefferson's Monticello. Monroe named his new home Highland because of its situation in the mountains. In 1799, Monroe's second child, a boy named James Spence, was born in Richmond. The baby never gained sound health and died at Highland less than a year later. His death devastated both James and Elizabeth Monroe, who never completely recovered from the loss. Monroe carried on with his duties as governor, despite his grief, and in 1802 the couple had another daughter, Maria Hester, who would be their last child. She was almost 16 years younger than her older sister, Eliza. In 1803, Monroe was asked by now President Thomas Jefferson to return to France as envoy extraordinary to assist Ambassador Robert Livingston in purchasing the port of New Orleans from the French government. Monroe once again took his entire family with him. They would not return to Virginia for another 4 years. During this assignment to France, Monroe made perhaps his greatest contribution to the growth of the American nation, the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon needed money to fund his war with Great Britain, and although the American representatives were tasked only with buying New Orleans, they were offered all of the Louisiana territory for just over $11 million. Monroe made the decision to accept the offer, and in doing so more than doubled the size of the United States. After completing the Louisiana Purchase, Monroe went on to London, where he acted as ambassador, and then on to Spain, where he also was responsible for diplomatic matters. In 1807, the Monroes returned to Virginia. Over the next 3 years, Monroe was elected to the Virginia Assembly again and would serve another term as governor. In 1811, President James Madison, also a personal friend of Monroe's, asked him to serve as his Secretary of State. At the age of 53, he had more diplomatic experience than any other political figure in the United States at the time. The Monroe family moved once again, this time to Washington, D.C. The following year, the War of 1812 broke out. By 1814, the situation was extremely grim, and Madison asked Monroe to serve simultaneously as both Secretary of State and Secretary of War. Monroe was one of the last office holders in the government who had any experience in fighting the British. Monroe and Madison were in Washington on the night that the British sacked the city and burned the White House. They escaped on horseback to a farm outside of the city. Mrs. Monroe and their children were safe at their home in Charlottesville. James Monroe's last step up the political ladder occurred in 1816 when he was elected the 5th President of the United States. His presidency would usher in a new period of peace and prosperity in the United States, which came to be known as the Era of Good Feeling. During his 2 terms in office, there was one event which would become the hallmark of his administration, the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine. The American Revolution of the previous century had begun a worldwide movement of rebellion against colonial powers. Many Spanish colonies in Central and South America rebelled against the Spanish monarchy and established independent republics. The United States officially recognized the existence of Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico in 1822. By 1823, the Spanish government was attempting to regain control over its empire and force its American colonies into submission once again. The government of France had joined with the Spanish in their efforts as well. Fearing French influence on the markets of the New World, the British proposed that the United States stand with them against the Franco-Spanish alliance. Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, argued against standing with the British, and instead suggested that the president make an independent statement in support of the former Spanish colonies and against European influence in the New World. Monroe followed Adams' advice and included these famous words in his 1823 address to Congress. "We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. but with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. Monroe's proclamation of 1823 resounded around the world. It was one of the first statements of foreign policy ever made by the young American nation. In effect, Monroe was saying three things to the nations of Europe. First, the American hemisphere was no longer open to colonization. Secondly, the United States had no desire to interfere in the internal affairs of Europe, and Europe should therefore stay out of the affairs of American nations. Lastly, the United States would consider any attempt by a European power to control an American nation as a hostile act against the United States. Although his career spanned nearly 50 years and included accomplishments like the Louisiana Purchase, Monroe would be most remembered for this simple statement. After the presidency, Monroe and his wife retired to a farm outside of Washington called Oak Hill. Mrs. Monroe would pass away after a long illness in 1830. The following year, Monroe died while visiting his young daughter at her home in New York City. He, like Jefferson and Adams before him, would die on the 4th of July.